So we are now going to refine the look of the frame and set up our final render settings. Right now everything looks too busy, and also the render itself is not very fine. So let's start with that second issue. We need to go to anti-aliasing settings, and the default here is geometry, which is fast but not very good quality. So let's set this to best, and I'm going to go for 1:1, 4:4 with a threshold of 5%. So the higher these levels are, the finer the render will be, but also it would take longer to render. And the threshold as well, the lower that is, the longer it's going to take to render, but the render will also look better. I think for this scene we can get away with 1:1, 4:4 and 5%. And sending this to the picture viewer, let's see if we can see a difference. So this is a geometry, and this is at best 1:1 and 4:4, and it does look cleaner than it was previously. Of course, it also took longer to render, 3 seconds versus 8 seconds. If I zoom in way in here to a particular area, this building with these vertical lines, you see in geometry that wasn't looking so fine, but now it's a bit better, and this is going to help with the smaller details and reflection each time when we increase the anti-aliasing like that. Additionally, I can also limit the number of reflections bouncing around in the scene. So that's in options in this ray depth, reflection depth, and shadow depth controls. Now we don't have any shadows in here, but I tend to set these settings at 6, 2, and 6 just to limit how many times those effects will be bounced around and rendered. Because beyond a certain point, you hit diminishing returns where the render doesn't look any better, but takes longer to render unnecessarily. So that's going down by 1 second of render time, which isn't a whole lot, but spread that across, hundreds of frames, that can start to add up. So by lowering the number of times reflections are bounced, it does look slightly different, but also it does help to clean up the whole look. And I want to continue along that same line. I might drop this down to 1 even, and let's see what that gives me. Generally, I wouldn't drop down to 1 on too many projects, but in this particular example, I think the lights are being bounced around too many times and it just looks too busy once again. But with reflection levels at 1, I much prefer this cleaner look, and also the render time has gone down by another second. So we've gone from this at 8 seconds to this at 6. Your own machine may be different, but you should be seeing similar gains, proportionally to what I'm seeing here. So I can only do so much with the reflection depth here. I actually don't want any of those lights to be reflected at all. So what I am going to do is I will clone the buildings and apply a couple of render tags to this. So with both of them selected, render tags and compositing. On the first set of buildings, I don't want them to be seen by any reflection. So turn that off. But let me show you what that would look like on its own. So disabling the new copy of the buildings. With the buildings not being seen by any reflections, it's going to change the look a bit too much for my liking. It's more washed out, and we no longer see like these dark parts of the buildings which create a better contrast. But those lights are not being reflected around as much, so the render looks cleaner overall. So I like that aspect of this, but of course I still want it to be contrasty like the previous version. So that's why we made this copy, and on this new copy, it's not going to be seen by the camera, so untick this, but it will be seen by the reflection. And the next step is to copy the building's material and switch off everything in the luminance channel and apply this copy of the material onto the new buildings, the copy there. Make sure to directly replace the material tag so that it inherits all the previous properties that we set, for the projection and tiling. When I move around the scene here, we are going to get some flickering because we have two sets of buildings overlapping each other. So this new copy we can disable in the picture viewer so that when we do move around, it doesn't intersect. I've just noticed we still have our guides visible in this scene. So the guide planes should also be hidden in the editor and also in the actual render too. But make sure not to hide the new buildings in the render because we are already hiding them with the camera. Let's jump into this angle once again and render this out one more time. And now we see this render is much cleaner than it was before. You may prefer the slightly busier looking frame, but I much prefer this. And what's happening here is that these buildings that we can see are reflecting a copy of the buildings without the luminance channel turned on. So overall, there aren't as many of these small luminance being bounced around in the render, and that results in something that looks less busy.